Chief Scott Pruitt. A new report says that he took this $100,000 trip to Morocco. Well, it was partly arranged by a former lobbyist, a longtime friend who went along with him.
Yeah, and that friend became a registered foreign agent for the Moroccan government, and his role in this trip is raising new questions this morning. CNN's Renee Marsh has more. Renee.
Well, John and Poppy, we're also now learning that Pruitt's trip to Morocco was twice as expensive as originally thought. This all according to the Washington Post. But back to that lobbyist involved in arranging that trip. Richard Smotkin not only helped arrange the trip, but he participated in meetings during the trip, including meetings with industry. Then just months later, the Moroccan government hired him to work as a foreign agent. It raises questions. Did he get the job because he successfully organized this trip for Pruitt? It's also very unusual for a lobbyist to be so involved in planning a trip for the head of a federal agency. But there's a lot more Pruitt news today. Just in the last 24 hours, we learned that two key aides abruptly left the agency, including the head of his security team. Democratic lawmakers say that Pruitt tried to set up a new EPA office in Tulsa, that is his hometown, for his convenience. And the New York Times reports an email from the lobbyist involved in Pruitt's $50 a night apartment shows that the lobbyist actually recommended people for a science advisory board. So all of these storylines fit into a larger pattern for what we know about Scott Pruitt dating back to his days as the Oklahoma's Attorney General. He was criticized then for being too close to lobbyists, and it all raises the question now, in his role as EPA administrator, is Scott Pruitt protecting the public's health or the industry's bottom line?
Renee Marsh, thank you for the reporting. Walter Schaub is here, our contributor and also former director of the Office of Government Ethics. Just to put it out really clearly, a $100,000 trip to Morocco while he's EPA administrator, arranged by a lobbyist and a friend, who then gets hired to make $40 grand a month, basically doing PR for Morocco. Significance?
This is a worst case scenario for government ethics. I feel like I want my head to explode right now because it's barely possible to process the one thing after another that Pruitt does. It's inconceivable in any other administration that he'd still be in this position. And of course, this latest revelation about the exorbitant cost of this trip, $100,000 with the lobbyist helping to plan it, that's just incredible, particularly because the whole point of the trip seems to have been to promote natural gas industry interests in terms of trade with Morocco. And it's really not clear what an EPA administrator has to do with that. We already have a Commerce Secretary and a U.S. Trade Rep and an Energy Secretary. Pruitt should be at home looking at the environment.
What's wrong, what would be wrong with a lobbyist helping plan a foreign trip?
Well, for one thing, usually the government itself, if it's paying, is going to be planning the details of the trip. So it already shows a very strange involvement of this lobbyist. And the fact that he traveled with Pruitt means that he had very excessive access to the man to bend his ears on policy issues after providing the free services of arranging the trip. But what's particularly troubling is this contract that the lobbyist landed with the Moroccan government, because it really does smell like a reward for having gotten a cabinet official over there. And that would be a misuse of position if that's what Pruitt was trying to help him do.
So, Walter, this is just the latest in a series of huge ethical dilemmas, to put it lightly, for the EPA administrator. You've got the purchase of this $43,000 soundproof booth for his office, which actually OMB is looking into now. You've got the exorbitant travel expenses. You've got the rental of the cheap housing from a lobbyist's wife, $50 a night there. Tom Price, former HHS secretary, was fired for seemingly a lot less, but that was after, the Obamacare repeal failed. So he arguably failed on one of his biggest missions from the president. Scott Pruitt has been pushing through the president's agenda very successfully. Is that the difference here?
I think it is. Tom Price and David Shulkin should be really upset right now that Scott Pruitt is still running around in his job. But they made it explicit at that congressional hearing last week where there were members of Congress defending him by pointing out what they perceive as his success in deregulatory efforts, which sends a very strong message that as long as we like you, as long as you do things we want substantively, ethics doesn't matter. And that's just really a terrible message because frankly, that's when it matters the most, to show that you can't buy your way out of ethics trouble with policy decisions that Congress and the White House like.
You know, Walter, you're an experienced attorney beyond everything else, and I'd like to get your take on a new statement from the president who seems to be engaged in his own defense in the Russia investigation, his own legal defense. He seems to be addressing some of the questions that came out yesterday that deal to his mindset when he was firing James Comey, suggesting firing Jeff Sessions, suggesting firing Robert Mueller. Let me read you what the president just wrote. The questions are an intrusion into the president's Article II powers under the Constitution to fire any executive branch employee. What the president was thinking is an outrageous as to the president's unfettered power to fire anyone. He's quoting someone who almost was his personal attorney, Joe DeGen over there. But it gets to this notion that is out there that the president it can't be suggested that he obstructed justice if he was doing it using a power the Constitution gives him. He can fire executive branch employees, correct?
What an outrageous tweet for him to have put. I mean, the man seems to think he's king, not president. It is true that he has the power to fire anybody he wants, and to the extent that that firing will actually take, I mean, look, Comey's not still in the job, that statement is true. But what he's really declaring with that tweet is the idea that a president can go around expressly firing people to prevent himself from being held accountable under the rule of law, that he will not be investigated. He did that with Comey and went on TV and admitted publicly that that was his reason, that he didn't like being investigated. And the timing now is a message to Rod Rosenstein and Robert Mueller and Jeff Sessions that he still doesn't feel he should be investigated. Well, whether or not this is a crime, if he continues to go down this road and fire people for investigating him, how many will it take for Congress to wake up and make a decision that the rule of law in this country matters and that the president isn't above that rule of law? It's Congress's job to intervene if that happens, and the penalty if he goes around repeatedly firing people for investigating should be impeachment.